Good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here for our final of the year Jersey Collective Reads author event. We started this in January, and this we didn't want to do one in December because it gets a little hectic for people. So this is our last one for this year, and we're so excited to have Joe Pompeo with us. I'm Kerri Sullivan. For those of you who don't know me, I am the founder of Jersey Collective and the editor of a book called New Jersey Fan Club, and I'm also a public librarian. And my co-host, Courtney.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Preiss. I am the author of the forthcoming novel, Welcome Home, Caroline Klein, which is a New Jersey book, takes place in Monmouth County. It's coming out April 16th, 2024 from Putnam Penguin Random House. And yeah, I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm really thrilled to be talking with Joe Pompeo, author of Blood and Ink. I think that, as Kerri mentioned, this has been going on since the beginning of the year, our Jersey Collective Reads. This was one of the first books that came up in conversation when Kerri approached me with this idea to do a New Jersey-based book club. So I'm really excited to finally dig in and cap off a great year with this conversation.
And Joe, thanks so much for being here. Do you want to just give a brief introduction and maybe tell people a little bit about the book too, in case there's some people here who haven't picked it up yet?
Yeah, sure. No, my name is Joe Pompeo. Thank you for having me and for your enthusiasm about Blood and Ink. It's my first book. It came out a little over a year ago in hardcover from HarperCollins and William Morrow, and paperback is actually coming out next month with some expanded material, some bonus new material that has surfaced, some new research that surfaced. So anyone who's really hooked on this mystery, you can get a little more. And if you haven't read the book, I would maybe just wait and get the paperback, because you'll get a little extra than what's in the hardcover. I'm a journalist. In addition to being an author, I'm a correspondent at Vanity Fair magazine currently, and I have written and worked for numerous other publications, from Politico, New York Observer, and I've also written for places like the New York Times and Bloomberg Business Week and yada yada yada, lots of other places. And I'm excited to be here. I'm in Montclair tonight in my home office. So since this is a Jersey event, thought I would.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I can't remember, did you grow up in New Jersey?
I did. I grew up in New Jersey. I went to Rutgers, where the story takes place. Oh, and you asked me to give my capsule review. This is basically a roaring 20s murder mystery. And it's also about the birth of tabloid media and tabloid culture in America in the Jazz Age. And you have this story of a murdered reverend who was found dead with his mistress, who was a singer in the church choir. And she was married to the sexton of the church, and the reverend was married to this very rich woman from a very prominent, illustrious family in New Jersey. It blows up into this huge scandal. There's a long investigation and bumbling detectives and all sorts of twists and turns, and a close involvement of the new tabloid press in the case, which carries on over the course of 4 years, and is really kind of brought to its climax thanks to the interference of the tabloid newspapers in New York. That's a really basic summary of what's a really complex story with so many characters you could barely keep track. So hopefully most of you, or maybe some of you, are familiar with the Hall Mills story. If not, read the book, or there's lots of other fantastic stuff about it out there, and I'm sure we'll get into that more with some of your questions maybe.
That was a great synopsis. I feel like giving like a tight synopsis is really hard to do, so I want to commend you. I'm curious. Okay, so knowing that you grew up in New Jersey, knowing that you're from New Jersey, went to college in the same area as this murder took place, I'm curious about how the Hall Mills, I keep wanting to say Hall's Mills, which is like a road by where I grew up. The Hall Mills murders, how this made it onto your radar. I had mentioned to you a little bit earlier before we started recording, but I had initially come across you and come across this book on the New Jersey is the World podcast. And listening to it made my jaw drop because I'd never heard of this case before. So I'm curious, like, was this something that you were familiar with growing up as like local lore, or did you come across it later? And when you came across it, did you know that you wanted to write about it, or did your interest sort of evolve over time?
Yeah, so no, I had never heard of it. Even having gone to Rutgers and lived in New Brunswick for 4 years, where there is a fair amount of local lore about this, and an archive at Rutgers libraries that was very important to putting to doing the research for this book. But I set out to do a book in this genre, historical true crime, narrative history. I wanted something like old and dark, and a story in particular that had like a fun sort of like angle of newspaper reporters running around and covering a sensational murder, which was the case back then. That was always a big part of these stories. Today we think of true crime stories. There's TV, there's all these digital kind of tabloids that cover these things, but back then these were big newspaper stories, and a lot of these crimes always had kind of like a media angle to it. And since that's what I cover professionally, that's like the beat I primarily report on. I wanted to do a story that kind of married those two things. So I was literally just looking. First, I read a lot. I've read a lot in this genre. This is like kind of like The Devil in the White City, Eric Larson, or David Grand sort of stuff. And I wanted to find a book like this. So I was talking with my agent, and we were just like, let's just find the right thing. And I paid a visit to a really brilliant scholar named Andy Tucker, who I had studied under in graduate school at the Columbia Journalism School some years ago. And she's a journalism historian, and I had taken her history classes where we studied these old like newspaper sensations, like going back to the 1800s, like the murder of Helen Jewett, and these kind of like the penny press of the Victorian era. And I just knew like I had so much fun in that class, learning about crime through this lens of media. So I thought she would be a good person to just like pick her brain and ask. Like, I literally went and sat down and caught up with her in the fall of 2018. Was like, I want to do a book like this. Where do I find stories like this? And we just started talking, and she was like, well, there's this murder and there was this, and she just, we were just talking about different crimes. And she mentioned at one point there was the Hall Mills murders down in New Brunswick. So immediately I was interested. Obviously, she also happened to have grown up in central New Jersey. So I was asked, what's that? And we started talking. And we'd also kind of separately, because there's a lot of other big crimes that happened in the 1920s. So we were talking about, she had also mentioned, the tabloid newspapers. There was these crazy, wild tabloid newspapers back then. And she was describing how they were just like outrageous, even by today's standards. And that's when I kind of got the idea of those two threads coming together. So I left with a notebook full of like possible things to pursue, but this quickly floated to the top of my list. And once I started looking into the story and realized how, full of these really amazing, wild characters it was, and how much it really did have this strong tie-in with the early tabloid press in a very, very direct way, it just, immediately became, it became the book. And we started working on the book proposal and spent a long time doing that. And that's how it all started.
How long did it take you from when you sent it to a publisher and had someone buy it? How long did the process take from there? Because I'd imagine this was like extremely research heavy. You have to write the book, but there's also so much work you have to do before you can even write anything. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So like I said, this meeting I had was probably in September, October 2018, and that's when I started researching this case, because a lot of research has to happen just to write the book proposal, or at least the type of book proposal I was writing. I have a very like commercially minded literary agency I work with, so they put a lot of work into developing proposals that they think are going to be marketable. So from that moment, there was about 8 or 9 months of research and editing and writing the actual proposal that went into this. And it was in the summer of 2019 when we finally took it to shopped it to publishers, and I went with HarperCollins. They bought it that summer. So that was about, by the time that happened, it was almost a year from when I had landed on the idea. And then it was another 3 years to publication. And even up to like most of the research was in the next like couple of years, really like the bulk of really, getting into archives and things like that. And of course, COVID coincided with that. So that was a really difficult period, because I was, raising 2 children and working at it. There was just months that I didn't work on the book at all. But I was doing, research goes up until like the very end. I was in copy edits and still kind of like adding new things. And so, it was really like a 4-year process from, the spark of the idea in like September 2018 to publication in September 2022.
Publishing is such a long, slow industry. It's so wild to look back at like the long arc of a book's life. That always fascinates me. I'm curious if there was a part of the research or like a key interview or some aspect of that work that went into it that really surprised you or that pushed the story in a way that you weren't expecting.
Well, there was 2 like surprises, in the sense that I didn't expect to find stuff like this come into my not my possession, but I didn't expect to get access to. And one of these was when I visited in early 2019. I visited the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office. This case was prosecuted in Somerset County, even though the murders, the victims and the eventual suspects, they were all from New Brunswick, but the murders occurred right over the border in Somerset County. So when this went to trial, it was this big sensation in Somerset County. So the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office in Somerville still has the evidence from this case, or a fair amount of it at least. And I was interested and checking out just anything they had. And in particular, I was looking for like the Rutgers archive I mentioned briefly is kind of drawn from the evidence that still exists in the prosecutor's office in Somerville and Somerset County. And a lot of those are like copies of certain documents and whatnot. And there's a lot of great stuff there. But what it didn't have was like, I was like, where like, detective interviews with witnesses from those early days, or where's like that sort of stuff, where's like the dialogue, and I was hoping that I might find some of that there, and they didn't have it. They were kind of like, this has probably been destroyed, and I'll come back to this. But what they did give me access to, which I wasn't expecting, was actual physical evidence that they have in these like plastic flip top totes that they just let me just rummage through, basically. So we're talking like the broken eyeglasses that Reverend Edward Hall was murdered in. I was able to like hold those, and this pair of stockings that the victim from the choir singer Eleanor Mills was wearing, and key pieces of evidence, this day calendar that belonged to the star witness who claimed to have seen the crime committed, who is this eccentric woman who raised pigs and became known as the pig woman. She was a pig farmer. I held the keys to her farm. I held the keys to the church. I mean, like, it was actually like handling this physical evidence, like touching the glasses that once rested on the face of the dead man who I've been, spending all of my time researching. That was a wild experience. And They also at this, I was talking to one of the evidence custodians there about this tabloid angle for the book, and he kind of like went away and went in another room. And the tabloids that were relevant were to this case, the first tabloids in America were the Daily News and the New York Daily Mirror, and there was a third one called the Evening Graphic. But really, like in the book, the two central ones are the New York Daily News, which still exists, and the Daily Mirror, which is this long gone obscure tabloid that William Randolph Hearst had created in the 1920s. So he comes back. He said, "Did you say the New York Daily Mirror?" And he has like a stack of original copies of the Mirror that had coverage from the trial. There was about like a dozen of them, and I just I unfolded these, and you can picture like brittle, old 100-year-old newsprint like just crumbling off the edges. And I'm trying to be as delicate as possible, but I was now holding original copies of this tabloid that was central to my story. So that was a really like something that was a big moment and a thrill. So coming back to what I was really looking for, I was these kind of like witness interviews or detective notes, anything like that, because the only other thing I had that was close to that was in the newspapers when characters would be interviewed by the newspapers, and that's not really as good as primary source material. So the prosecutor's office had a list of all of the interviews that had occurred over the course of the 4 years, in 1922 and 1926 when the case came revived. So I knew that like these once existed, but I really wanted them. And I saw a list of like all the people who had been interviewed and the deposition they gave on this date. But I kind of resigned myself to never finding it. And then I was like Googling around sometime that spring of 2019, deep into the proposal, very far along with the proposal. And I just went back on the public website, the website of the New Brunswick Public Library, and saw something about they had a Hall Mills murder case collection. And like the last time I'd been on their website months earlier, that this was not there. And suddenly I saw that they had this like these documents from the case. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? So I got in touch with them, and it turns out that they had recently acquired, miraculously and very coincidentally, all of the depositions and witness statements from 1922 and from 1926, and also a complete transcript of the grand jury testimony from 1922. So this is a couple of thousand pages of exactly what I was looking for. And there's this really wild story. I write about it in my source notes about how they just happened to like acquire this collection. So that was like that was the moment where it was like just the fireworks going off, sort of. And I actually didn't even get to go through that stuff until after I sold the book proposal, and so I didn't even know how important and how essential that material was going to be until I actually got my hands on it that summer after the book was sold. And it was a really key piece of the research for the book. So those were kind of like, I think, my two most exciting moments maybe from the process. And then of course there's this new trove I mentioned, which was surfaced after the hardcover came out, because it got a lot of attention, and people would contact me sometimes about I was related to this kind of peripheral character or whatever. People had different levels of interesting stories because the book kind of like shook the trees. But the public library contacted me once again and said something. I think that the subject line was like the jackpot is en route or something like that. And this woman actually had in her possession for decades the personal records from the case of Frances Hall's personal attorney. Frances Hall was the rich woman I mentioned who was married to the dead pastor, and eventually was accused of murdering him and went on trial and everything. So her personal attorney, who's a key figure in the book, 8 boxes of his personal papers. And that's when I mentioned I had this kind of new material. I've went through a fair amount of it, and that was actually the most incredible discovery, because it was the most primary. In terms of talking about primary source material, this stuff in this guy's archive was the most primary, because it's handwritten, literally handwritten correspondence, like from jail in some cases. I mean, just had so much stuff in there. I didn't even get to go through all of it. And that was not part of my research for the book, but it actually probably was the most exciting discovery of the whole thing. And you can get a taste of it in the paperback.
all of the documents coming together in this way. I mean, certainly this bonus round of documents, but the documents that found their way to you after you had submitted the proposal, like that is so the universe conspiring in your favor. Like
I
that is
think, yeah, it truly is. And I think that the book would just not have, I don't even know if I really could have done it justice without that stuff, or it would have like taken a different, I would have had to like kind of fill it. There would have been more filler, I think, and maybe I wouldn't have had as rich of a narrative about the actual, murder investigation, the investigative and components of it. So it definitely was the universe on my side, I think.
And a lot of the dialogue in the book, is that pulled from a lot of those records, like quotes and stuff, or like things people said to detectives and such?
Yeah, it's still, there's a variety of different things that are firsthand dialogue. A newspaper report, I would consider that firsthand dialogue if a character is saying something to a reporter, but could he have mistranscribed it or whatever. And then there are transcripts of depositions, which are like Q&A, a question and the person answers it, and there's a person doing shorthand, and then it eventually gets typed up. And that's pretty good. That's pretty good, although you find errors in those too sometimes. And then there's statements that are written in a character's voice, but have kind of been like drawn from an interview a detective or a prosecutor did, and they write it out in the form of a statement. So there's a lot of dialogue in that. And then, of course, I think the dialogue you can be the most absolutely confident in is probably like from a transcript either of the grand jury or the trial, because a court stenographer is taking those notes. It's probably like the most accurate, and you definitely know, like you can see a lawyer asks this question this way and the person on the witness stand answers it this way. So yeah, a lot of dialogue from all of that stuff, but also newspaper reports and in some cases other books that could be written in the first person. There was a lot of there's telegram correspondence from one of my main characters is a tabloid editor who starts at the Daily News and then gets poached to go to the Mirror, and he's the one who really, as I said, the tabloids played a really key role in kind of bringing this case back to life after it had gone cold. This tabloid editor named Phil Payne really was the one who spearheaded that. So I had all of his telegrams that he corresponded with the owner of the Daily News first, and then with William Randolph Hearst back and forth. So they're writing to each other, and sometimes in this stilted sort of like telegraph form, but there's a lot of dialogue from that. And also, sometimes dialogue comes in the form of like a character, either in an article or even in testimony, recalls what they said one night. A character could be on a witness stand and then, well, what did you say? And I said, where are you going tonight, Reverend? Whatever it is. So they're kind of like recalling what they said. And in good chance they probably didn't actually say it that way necessarily, but especially for like an old historical book like this, I was satisfied enough that if it was something that was in quotes and a person was recalling their recollection of it, I would note in my source notes where it came from and use it as dialogue just to keep the narrative going. But what the book doesn't have is any invented dialogue. Anything that's in a quote comes from a document somewhere, and is presented at least as firsthand dialogue, even though in some cases it could be coming from someone's memory or recollection or reconstruction of what they said. But yeah, certainly like the primary source stuff from the public library and the transcripts from the trials was very key to having characters in their own voices. And then I should also say, like, there's love letters between the Reverend and the choir singer that created some really good dialogue. Other kind of like correspondence like that, or something like letters, like a detective writes a letter to the prosecutor, stuff like that as well. In written form could be dialogue.
I'm curious, piggybacking off of that, you had mentioned earlier, and I think it'll be apparent to the readers, like there is a wild cast of characters. Like there are so many different big personalities, like vibrant characters involved in this story. And I'm curious if you had one in particular that you were most compelled by or drawn to, and why is it the pig woman? I'm just kidding, but I'm curious which
And no,
one.
yeah, the pig woman is definitely one of the most eccentric characters. I mean, there's a lot of just eccentric characters in the book that in different ways, you can kind of fall in love with them just because they're weird or outrageous or whatever. I see that the two most important characters in the book are Frances Hall. Again, this is the widow and accused murderess of her husband Edward Reverend Hall, the philandering minister who is sleeping around with the church choir. And the other really significant important character is Phil Payne, the tabloid editor. And the book starts, these people are so far apart, and like they don't know one another. There's no connection between them at all. And the whole book is kind of like this process of them being drawn closer and closer together, and eventually colliding, because it is Phil Payne that basically brings this world of trouble upon Frances Hall when he and the Daily Mirror revive this case, and she eventually she despises him, and she faults him for kind of like accuses him of just kind of manufacturing a sensation. And so those two characters, they're kind of like these speeding bullets, like heading towards one another, and they're also just really, really great characters in their own way. Frances Hall came from such a distinguished lineage. She kind of brings that like kind of element of like money and old world money and power, and she had like came from a line of forebears who like fought in the Revolutionary War and corresponded with the founding fathers. I found in my research she's like distantly related to Edith Wharton, who very much symbolizes like a Victorian woman of her age. So she kind of has that like wealth and money that you need for the book, and that kind of like she's this kind of like this haughty Victorian woman who's very much, her world is kind of like ending as this new world of modernity and the Roaring Twenties comes in. So there's a lot of like, there's a kind of really good thematic clash between her worldview and this kind of like the dying Victorian world and the new era of modernity. And then Phil Payne, he's my favorite character in the book, the one I was most passionate about and drawn to. And I think in some ways, because I was able to relate to him the most, he's also like, a guy who grew up in New Jersey. He actually grew up not far from, he grew up when he was younger in Canada, but then his formative years were spent in Perth Amboy, so actually outside of New Brunswick, and he gets started in newspapers, and he works his way up, and he moves to Hudson County, and he starts working for New York newspapers and moves his way up in the world. He was young, he was in his 20s and 30s. I mean, he was like a young, rising kind of like newspaper editor guy from New Jersey that I related to. And he's also a really mischievous sort of character. He really embodies, like when we think of tabloid media, these kind of like this mischievousness and this kind of like stunt type of journalism. He was a pioneer of that, one of the first to really employ some of those tactics, but also very funny and humorous, but also like good natured, and someone who championed a lot of like female journalists at the tabloids, where it was easier for them to find jobs and kind of like make names for themselves at these newer sort of newspapers, as opposed to the broadsheets, which they had women too, but definitely still like very male dominated sort of culture. He's a guy who was so eager to serve his country in World War I that he was like trying to get enlisted, but he had really bad hearing and bad eyesight. So like he just kept getting rejected, and he joined the Knights of Columbus War News Service and like went overseas. And, so he was just like a really mischievous, troublemaking character, but also like a good guy, and someone that I related to like professionally and regionally and everything. So he was really my favorite of the book.
I love that. I thought something that really struck me is I really admired how you wove together like not just the story of this case, which is obviously really compelling and there's a lot there, but how you made that connection to the tabloid media and the journalism of the time. I thought that was really, really interesting. Why do you think this case like isn't as well known as some other, like I can think of a lot of really famous true crime things from this time, like the Black Dahlia, or just like other things that, like, there's movies about it, television shows about it, lots of books. Like this one, I feel like it was so, at the time, such a big deal, and then it kind of faded into this like obscurity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have like a answer, you know, for certain, but I definitely think when you think of like big New Jersey crimes in this era, you think of Lindbergh, which happened just a few years later. It happened just about 20 minutes away, kind of in the same place. It was a much bigger media sensation than anything else, because Charles Lindbergh, he was created in the 1920s, in 1927, when he was this unknown pilot, and then becomes literally almost overnight this larger than life. Like when he gets off the plane in Rome, it's like Jesus. I mean, he was like as big as a world celebrity could get. And then a few years later, you have him involved in this horrific murder case with his son, also unsolved. Some people might say that they believe they know who killed the Lindbergh baby. But an even more sensational case just a few years later, involving someone who was already like a celebrity, versus the people in this story that were kind of more anonymous. I mean, they became famous at the time, but they weren't really even something like Fatty Arbuckle, that's not as big as Lindbergh, but it's more recognizable than Hall Mills because it was this famous actor. So I mean, maybe it's just because it was eclipsed by the Lindbergh case and didn't involve. I mean, there's a lot of famous cameos in the book that come into proximity with this case in different ways, but the characters were just like kind of like they if this hadn't happened, no one would have ever heard of them. So maybe it's a combination of those things, but probably like I think probably the easiest answer is maybe like just the Lindbergh case eclipsed it. There's only so much like major famous true crime in one span of a few years that could really endure. And I should say there are a lot of cases from the 1920s that were either scandals or other crimes that were quite monumental in their day, that are even more obscure than the Hall Mills case, just because it was a really like wild decade with a lot of crime in the air, and prohibition, and this, it kind of just, I think prohibition really in some ways it triggered this backlash that led to a lot of criminality. So there are just like a lot of crimes in the 1920s overall, and only so many of them can rise to the level of like something that we remember with the same recognition as Jack the Ripper or whatever. Lindbergh happened in 1932, but like fudging the dates a little bit here, but that's kind of like my best guess or best answer to that question.
It's within a 10-year period. I think that's valid.
Yeah.
New Jersey only had room in their hearts for one major crime of the decade. I'm curious about your take on sort of like contemporary true crime. Blood and Ink puts into perspective how, like, coming off of a war, coming off of a pandemic, this sort of like 1920s audience, for lack of a better word, was like primed to get hooked on a true crime story, right? Like they're looking for this new obsession, they're looking for a distraction of sorts, like some kind of change in the narrative. I'm curious, like, how do you see our contemporary relationship to true crime evolving in years to come? I feel like there's already been kind of like a change in the conversation around it. Like, I feel like there's been like a spate of novels that are happening from the perspective of true crime podcasters, or like about that.
Like only murders in the building, like a streaming show. I think that the modern, there's some people who would argue like that the true crime boom is like a myth, because there's always been true crime and people have always been obsessed with it. But I do think that what we're talking about, this kind of like latest surge in the interest in this stuff, I think a lot of it was like technologically driven by podcasts and streaming, especially with Serial, obviously that very distinctly kicked something off. and kicked off a whole genre of other podcasts like that. And I think that there were certain documentaries that started, popping up. And I really think like streaming audio, streaming television drove a lot of the obsession. The streaming service, they're just filled with like documentaries on every like serial killer that existed, or whatever. And everyone wanted to make the next whatever it was, the next Staircase, or what was the Making a Murderer, or the next serial, whatever. So I think that there's like a technological component to why there's been this kind of renewed interest now. I'm not like a true crime connoisseur. I mean, I watched all the big ones, that the Jinx or whatever. I'm interested, but my interest is more in like historical true crime, and I kind of approach it more from like a narrative history interest. Like the true crime that I read, I don't read true crime that's more recent. I tend to read things that are Victorian or Gilded Age, or early 20th century, into maybe some mid-century stuff, but I'm like Black Dahlia era, which is like the late 40s. But I'm really interested in like historical true crime and narrative history. And I think some of the more ethical questions that come up around modern true crime is that there's like issues of re-victimization and re-traumatization, and profiting off of people's the misery of like families of victims, and things like that. There's a certain detachment, I think, with historical true crime, both in like it happened so long ago that, I mean, it's all horrific, but there's something more horrific about the killings in Idaho of these college students that happened last year, and you're seeing it happen in real time, and you're seeing like the parents and all. There's less of that when you're researching historical cases. And there's something that I think I don't want to say like a bit more fun, but like with a case like this, it's the wild roaring 20s. There's all these crazy characters. Like there's a certain levity that you could, I think, bring to it that is maybe not as appropriate for stories that are happening now. In the case of my book, even there aren't even descendants of any of the central characters, the suspects or the victims. There's no direct descendants. So, that's also like a kind of like a, you're worried about how families are going to react to things. I didn't even have that kind of consideration with this, but I also do wonder about, I think, you wonder, these people have been dead for so long, and what are they rolling over in their graves over this, or would some of them want this? Would they, you kind of want to like be as respectful of your characters as you can, while still kind of delighting in the things that make them such fun characters. I think that's harder to do with cases that are current or more recent. They feel, and there's more like sadness for me involved in cases that involving people who have recently been killed. So I'm not as interested in it. I also just like history and getting lost in things. So that's a very long-winded response to what you asked me, but I wanted to kind of get into some of the distinctions I see between within the genre, because even some of the true crime coming out now, there's tons of it it's kind of a whole subgenre of stuff that's very old, and I think it's a little different than the kind of like the serial genre, or the Making a Murder, the Murdoch murders, all that sort of stuff. And that's not to criticize it in any way. And there's really good storytelling that happens around that, and storytelling that has criminal justice components to it. So it's important to tell those stories too. But there is a little more to consider when you're doing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. How would I know this? The fact that there are no direct descendants,
Yeah.
The sort of like stars of Blood and Ink is really interesting. And I think that, again, not to knock like people who are telling more contemporary stories or examining true crime that happened a little bit closer to present day, but I think that being able to examine this historical story or like lean into a story that did take place a long time ago gives you access to, I mean, Blood and Ink is a perfect example because it feels like this really unique intersection, not only of the true crime story that's happening, but you're doing this really, you know, deft job of examining tabloid culture and the sort of like media take back then. You know, it's the sort of like true crime plus story. It leaves room to examine more of what was going on at the time.
Yeah, and how it sort of like in some ways leads us to where we are today. You know, there's I think that for books like this, you know, they always have to have kind of a next layer that is a little bigger than just. I mean, sometimes some things are just a great crime story, but I find that the best books, you know, are kind of like have these sort of braided narratives. You know, with like Devil in the White City, for example, you have the H.H. Holmes running around murdering women in his murder castle, and then you have the creation of this, you know, this World's Fair and this ginormous Ferris wheel, and just finding ways in which, you know, a crime says something about the period it took place in, but could also like kind of tell us something about where we are today. I think that we, you know, in terms of our true crime session today, our true crime obsession today, you know, I think that you can see some seeds of that in the tabloids of the 1920s and the way that they, you know, hardly the first form of media to make crime sort of entertainment in the sense that people like reading about it, but definitely the first to make it overtly like a form of entertainment in the sense that they were using enormous photos and having more fun with it. And like, you know, these are characters and they're putting them on the front page in a way that had never been done before, and really like playing with news as entertainment in a way that hadn't been done before so overtly. I think that, you know, is kind of a through line we see to other forms of tabloid media and true crime to come. So to your point, yes, I think that it's important for these books to kind of have a bigger story to tell than just the crime itself.
I thought the like the police procedural stuff was really interesting too, how they like their, I guess, jurisdiction was, they were arguing about that, and you know, like whose case is this, and then also just like that people were just trampling this crime scene and contaminating it and coming and taking souvenirs, and people were selling like popcorn. And so yeah, that like all of that obviously had implications on like what they did differently next time someone was murdered in that area, that, you know, they wouldn't, the same things wouldn't have happened. Like we don't do that now, obviously there's
Yeah,
procedures in place.
you're learning about like what maybe, you know, the state of forensics of a small rural police force in 1922, you know, what their capabilities would have been, but also like you're learning kind of I think that some of the things I learned about was you know, the political climate of New Jersey, and you know, the democratic machine with, you know, the powerful political bosses in Jersey City. They come into this story in a very big way, you know, because they are the ones who, the administration, when the case comes back to life, is a Democratic administration, and they, you know, Phil Payne is this tabloid editor living in Hudson County. He knows these guys, and they pretty much reopen the case and run the case, and they clash in different ways with kind of like the patrician Republican upbringing of, you know, Victorian woman Frances Hall and her rich relatives, and also like the more rural provincial kind of setting of Somerville, where, you know, it's this small rural town where this trial of the century descends on it, and there's, you know, hundreds of reporters tramping around town, and the whole place is disrupted because these big, you know, these politicians from New York City and this meddling tabloid editor kind of like, you know, brought this thing back to life. And they're resentful because there's editorials in the local papers about, you know, why are the local taxpayers footing this crusade of a New York tabloid newspaper and these Democrats in Hudson County. So like there's other ways that a kind of a story like this could tell you about, you know, the political climate of the day, or like, you know, the state of, as you point out, policing of the time. There's a lot of good historical threads to unspool here.
Cool. Yeah, all right. So we're almost at time. So we always like to ask everyone before we let the audience ask any questions, just if you have any recommendations of any books, movies, anything you want to shout out that either while you were working on this was something that you would recommend to people that liked your book, or also just anything in general that you want to recommend.
Or anything else? I got, I mean, like David Grann's really big right now. If you haven't read Killers of the Flower, I haven't seen the movie yet. But that was also another, really important true crime book of the 1920s. I enjoy all of Kate Winkler Dawson's stuff. She's another like historical true crime sort of person. Right now I'm reading Thurston Moore's memoir, Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth. I just started digging in to that. I just started on Spotify they have audiobook content now. I just started one that's I've seen it at the bookstore, and I have too many things I'm reading right now, but Megyn Kelly's husband, Douglas Brunt, has a new book out that's this kind of fascinating pre-World War I sort of like disappearance of something diesel, diesel of like, diesel fuel. It's this kind of like rollicking sort of like intriguing mystery story, possibly murder related, but I should know what it's called. You put me on the spot. But I just started digging into that, and I've seen it in the bookstore. I think it was a bestseller too. The Mysterious Case of Rudolph Diesel, that's the other thing I'm digging into right now. And I love, like, in terms of just mystery storytelling, and in terms of like classic fiction, I'm a huge Wilkie Collins fan, and like, this genre of Victorian sensation literature. Wilkie Collins he was a contemporary and friend of Charles Dickens, but did not become nearly as famous, but wrote what are considered some of the first detective stories, and other just kind of sensational novels from the Victorian era. I'm a huge fan of his work, and insofar as, like, as you say, I was telling kind of a police procedural and a detective story. I do like reading like kind of detective fiction and mystery fiction in general. So there's a smattering of things for for your audience to check out.
Great, thank you. So we can keep asking more questions if no one else has any questions, but we definitely want to give people the opportunity, if anyone who's here this evening has anything they want to ask, or if anyone just wants to compliment Joe on his book, we welcome that as well. I just changed it so that you should be able to unmute yourselves. So if anyone wants to jump in, or someone asked a question in the chat. Rob asked, roughly where was the murder? Where is DeRussey's Lane in modern day Central Jersey?
Yeah, so if you know New Brunswick and Easton Avenue, if you're going on Easton Avenue, I guess northwest-ish, I think it would be, away from Rutgers campus, you would basically come to the border of New Brunswick and what is, I guess, now Franklin Township, at something that's called the Landing Lane Bridge, which kind of links up with Piscataway Highland Park on the other side. And that leads to a road called Franklin Boulevard, which, if you're going on Easton Avenue, again, away from Rutgers, if you made a left onto Franklin Boulevard, that basically would have been DeRussey's Lane. And there's a street off of that, I believe it's called Rodney Street or Rodney Court or something, that is said to be the actual spot of this smaller kind of like Lover's Lane where the murders took place. So I think what I just described, you kind of have to know the area to know what I'm talking about. But if you want to look on a map, like look up Franklin Boulevard in Somerset or Franklin Township, whatever, that would pretty much be DeRussey's Lane. And it goes between Hamilton Street and New Brunswick, which leads into New Brunswick, and Easton Avenue, which leads into New Brunswick. There's this artery called Franklin Boulevard that links the two. So that's kind of the setting for where the murders took place. And they were, it was all farms back then, and a dirt road, basically.
I feel like there's at least like a Reddit thread that has some like aerial shots of, or
Yeah.
like a Google Maps screenshot that shows it, or like the approximation.
Yeah, I think I've seen it. It's in the whoever lives there. And actually, there's I know that you all know the people from Thinkery in Verse, which is a great theater company based in New Brunswick, sort of like an artistic experimental theater company that staged a play about the Hall Mills murders in St. John the Evangelist, which is the church where the characters, where the minister was Reverend Hall ministered, and where Eleanor was in the choir. And it's still an active church today. And they put on this amazing immersive play about the case. And they've done a bunch of like supplementary Hall Mills stuff. And I believe that they have some sort of like documentary type thing coming out. And I know that they actually went and like interviewed the people who live in the house, which is the house on the property where the bodies are believed to have been discovered.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know the status of that, but I do know that they actually talked to the people, and I'm sure I think that the people who lived there had some some interesting things to say, but I don't want to get ahead of their production. But if you follow Thinkery in Verse, I would look out for that and future stuff they're putting out on the Hall Mills case.
Does anyone else have any questions?
So in the paperback, there is going to be additional information that you found out after you wrote the book?
Yes. So I got a email like in this past February, I think, from the director of the New Brunswick Public Library, where this Hall Mills murder case collection I described exists. I spent a lot of time there. I got to know the library people very well, were friendly. And she informed me that this woman had contacted her, this woman named Rhonda, who lives in like far southwestern New York State. And she had read Blood and Ink, and she saw the parts in the book where I described this find that the New Brunswick Public Library had, and she thought, I want to do something. She herself, this woman Rhonda, is she like runs the historical society in her town. It's called Portville, New York. So she's a kind of person who's into archives and genealogical research and that sort of thing. And she wanted these records to be in good hands. So she called Kim and said, does the library want these? She said yes. And Kim called me, and my deadline for the paperback was coming up very soon. And I said, I got to go look at this stuff, because if I have a chance to get it into this next edition. So I went up there in March, and these are like 8 legal size boxes, and also 6 volumes of bound newspapers, including the tabloids in the book. So it's a lot of stuff to go through, and I spent as much time as I could over the 2 days I was in Portville, New York, going through it all. And so it's not so. Yes, I've found things that, if you know this story, I found things that are illuminating in different ways, and I have found like additional just like voice of characters. Like there's handwritten notes from Frances Hall for one of the main characters. There wasn't a ton of like her dialogue that was just unfiltered in the book. So I mean, there's definitely will add like a lot of texture, and it will add some bits of intrigue that might shed lights on different parts of the story and the case, but no smoking gun that I was able to find as of yet. And I'm sure that one does not exist, but I basically wrote a full extra chapter that describes this journey and describes what I found in this archive and what I found most interesting and why, and how it relates to other parts of the story. And these documents are now in possession of, they've been taken to New Brunswick, and the library the archivist is going through them and cataloging them. And eventually, once that process plays out, it's something the public will be able to access as well.
Okay, I'll have to get your paperback.
I didn't make you get it twice, but
That's okay. And you're very good speaker. Thank you very much, and a very good writer.
thank you so much.
Does anyone else have anything? I saw Rob put another comment in the chat about the audiobook. I listened to the audiobook as well. I did a combination of read it and listen to it. The audiobook taught him how to finally pronounce something I'm not even gonna attempt. I went to Rutgers as well, so I've seen that.
The park, or what was it? Baclue Park, or what?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Is that what he's? Yeah. So when I was at Rutgers, like we called it Bucolic Park, and when I started doing this book, there was, old New Brunswick people were like, oh no, it's Buckaloo Park, but I believe it's like Scottish, and I think the pronunciation that the narrator for the audiobook must get the accurate pronunciation. I think it's like Buccleuch Park, which sort of sounds Scottish to me, I guess.
Yeah. I noticed they mentioned Lake Hopatcong in the audio book, and he pronounced it, I want to say it was like Hoppet Kong, which
Yes.
shook me to my core, because I was like, is that the correct way to say that word? And
Yeah, but we're not gonna go with that. It's Hopatcong. Some things you need to just stick with the way you've always pronounced them,
Yeah, well, it's like everything gets changed when, different people say it different times and different cultures. But yeah, I was like laughing at that in my car. Does anyone, we have time for like one more, if anyone else has something they would like to say, or if Courtney, if you want to ask another question.
I want to ask one of my goofy New Jersey questions.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
I'm curious, like, if you had folks visiting you from out of town, somebody who had never been to New Jersey before, what would be a couple of stops on the like Joe Pompeo tour of New Jersey you can't let them leave the state without seeing, whether it's an attraction, like somewhere to eat, somewhere you grew up loving?
If I had to sell people on New Jersey, I would like take them to like Princeton for a day, just to like give someone like my literary agent, kind of splits her time between New York City and Western Massachusetts, and no concept of New Jersey at all. And I actually, like, she was so into this story, she became so immersed in it along with me, that I took her to New Brunswick actually, because we went and at one point, and there was a guy who was doing like kind of like this Hall Mills buff, amateur historian sort of guy that was doing like a walking tour one fall of maybe 2019. And we had him, I talked to him for the book a little bit, and he offered to give us like a private walking tour. So I took her through like a lot of these sites are on the Douglas campus, kind of in that part of town. And we got, just getting like Jersey pizza, this pizza place, and it's kind of fancy pizza place downtown New Brunswick. She was just like, oh, she still talks about that pizza to this day. But I'd always just like to try to take people to kind of some of the town, these really kind of like, beautiful, quaint, historic towns that people never, would stereotypically not associate with New Jersey. I probably have better stuff than that to think of if I thought a little harder of my Jersey points of interest. But oh no, you know what? Actually, like, probably like some of the shore towns that I love too, because I love the Jersey Shore. I kind of half grew up there, had a shore house growing up. So I would take people to, whether it's Asbury Park or Cape May or something like that.
That's a good answer. I'm an Asbury Park girly, so I appreciate that. But I know exactly what you mean about Princeton. I feel that way. I definitely feel that way about Princeton, or like Haddonfield, like just like picking a town and there's like a quaint main street and there's a record store and there's a coffee shop and there's a bookstore and there's an ice cream shop, like everything.
New Brunswick, it's like, it's not as nice like Princeton, but Rutgers is like, it predates the Revolutionary War. It's an old, there's just history. There's like such history and just seeing like the old buildings and stuff, it's not something you would that people who again are have attitude about the state maybe, or think of the more stereotypical New Jersey sort of things. But also like I was really, I was always fascinated by all the like haunted, weird New Jersey sort of sites growing up. And I live where I live in Montclair. It's like, all the Sopranos destinations. I live up the, just up the road from the famous final scenes of the Sopranos, Halston's. I mean, there's just too many answers to this question, I guess, to name them all in a quick final.
That's fair.
Final. We appreciate you scratching the surface.
But yeah, so that's been about an hour. So we don't want to take up more of your time. We appreciate your time and you being here, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening.